Hello guys, you all are most welcome to this very new YouTube channel. Today is Buddha Purnima, so happy Buddha Purnima to you all. I think today would be the most appropriate time to post this video because today is Buddha Purnima and we will be covering all Buddhism related topics in this video. I will post this video in two parts. So the first part will cover NCERT class 6th chapter 7, that is new questions and ideas, and this is the chapter that is relevant to Buddhism. Then we will cover NCERT class 6th theme 4 in part 1, and then later on we will cover previous year questions from 1996 to 2000. The remaining part, the remaining all the areas will be covered in the part 2. In the part 2 I will post previous year questions from 2001 to 2020, and also I'll share my personal notes from the book A.L. Basham. So A.L. Basham, the book is titled A Wonder That Was India. So you will not have to go through the book and all the pages. I'll cover my personal notes in the part 2. If this video can help out even 5 or even 10 students, I would consider it worthwhile to create this video. So I will provide timestamps in the video description for your convenience so that you can refer specific sections if you want to. So without further ado, let's get started. So we'll start with the NCERT class 6th, our past, the chapter 7. Now we will start with the story of the Buddha. Buddha was also known as Gautam, and his other name was also Siddharth. He was the founder of the Buddhism, and he was born about 2005 years ago. So 2500 years ago would be 500 BC. It's 500 BC in India, so it is the time when the Mahajanpadas are coming up. Magad is gaining prominence, and then the Buddha belonged to a small Gan. Gan is like a group. It is a group of people, and he belonged to the Sakya Gan and was a Kshatriya. So we can assume that the question would be, which Gan did Buddha belong to? Now he was also wandering in search of knowledge, and he left the comforts of his home in search of knowledge. He finally decided to find his own path to realization and meditated for days on end under a peepal tree at Bodh Gaya. This is important because it is always asked, where did Buddha attained his enlightenment? So he attained his enlightenment under a peepal tree at Bodh Gaya, which is in Bihar. Also, then he gave his first sermon in Sarnath. So this is also an important place in his life, Sarnath, as well as Bodh Gaya. And then obviously this is also an important place, that is Kushinara, where he passed away after teaching people and giving his sermons. He passed away at Kushinara. The Buddha taught that life is full of suffering and unhappiness. Obviously Buddhism is related to, the concept of Buddhism is about annihilating desires. So if you have desires, then there would be suffering. So, and if you have more and more desires, you will never be happy. There is this term tanha. Tanha is like a thirst, that is also desire to achieve more and more, and you will be never content. He taught that this constant craving could be removed by following moderation in everything. So how could the tanha be removed? It could be removed by following moderation in everything. He also believed in karma. So this is also a very UPSC favorite question, that does Buddhism believe in karma? So Lord Buddha believed in karma. He said that whether good or bad, whatever your deeds are, they affect us both in this life and also the afterlife, the next life. The Buddha taught in the language of the ordinary people, Prakrit. So the Prakrit is here. It is mentioned that Buddha used to teach people in the language of Prakrit. But you will also read that most Buddhist literatures are written in the language Pali. What was the language used to compose the Vedas? So it was Sanskrit. You would know that. Now this image is of a Sarnath Stoop. The Sarnath Stoop was a building that was built to mark the place where the Buddha first taught his message. So Buddha gave his first sermon at Sarnath. This stoop is also known as Dhamek Stoop. Dhamek Stoop. The Sanskrit version of this word is Dharma Rajika Stoop. So the Sanskrit version is Dharma Rajika Stoop. So this stoop is in UP. It is 13 kilometers away from Varanasi, and in 640 AD, Yuan Sang, this was a Chinese traveler, Yuan Sang, visited Sarnath, and he has mentioned that this stoop was standing at a height of 300 feet. This is all the details I know about Sarnath stoop. Now this is a story of Kissa Gautami. So this is actually an example of how Gautam Buddha used to encourage people to think for themselves. So like he used to encourage thoughts and not just to follow his teachings. He wanted people to think for themselves and question the whole concept of suffering and desires themselves. So he used to do that. This was his idea of teaching. Now this is related to Upanishads, so we would not be covering that in this video. We would be covering now the Sangh. Sangh, you must have heard about Sangh in republics like Vaji also. So Sangh is like an organization or association. It is common to both Jainism and Buddhism. Sangh, when talking about Sangh in the context of Jainism and Buddhism, it was an association of those who left their homes. So these were the people who left their homes and then they collectively formed an association which was called Sangh. The rules made for the Buddhist Sangh were written in a book called Vinay Pitak. This is also important. So Vinay Pitak was a book where the rules were written down for the Buddhist Sangh. All men could join the Sangh. Children had to take permission from their parents. So the children had to take permission of their parents. Slaves had to take permission of their masters. The people who worked for the king had to take permission from the king, and the debtors, like the people who had taken debt from someone, had to take the permission of the creditors. The creditor is the person from whom they have taken the debt. Women had to take the permission of their husbands. Men and women who joined the Sangh led simple lives. So what all were they supposed to do? They would roam around, like teach people, and then beg for food. The men who joined the Sangh were known as bhikkhus. They were known as bhikkhus, and the women were known as bhikkhunis. So as I said, they taught others and helped one another. They also held meetings to settle any quarrels. So like this is what I have observed, is that Gautam Buddha took all, like he belonged to Vaji Sangh. So he has taken the word Sangh, and then there were meetings held in republics where people used to discuss about war and peace and about certain measures they could take to overcome certain situations and adversities. So this was also being these meetings were also being held in republics. So in sangha also, which is in Buddhism related to an association, meetings were supposed to be held to settle any quarrels. Those who joined the sangh included Brahmins, Kshatriyas, merchants, laborers, barbers, courtesans, and slaves. So people across the whole society were joining sangh, and there were no restrictions. Many of them wrote down the teachings of the Buddha. Some of them also composed beautiful poems describing their life in the sangh. So they were not only allowed to join, but they were also writing down the teachings and also composing poems about their life. Guys, it's raining heavily outside, so I hope the audio is clear. Now we are coming to monasteries. So why were they required? Why were they built? What was their purpose? These Buddhist and Jain monks were traveling throughout the year teaching people, and they were traveling from place to place. The only time it would become difficult for them to travel was the rainy season. So their supporters would build them temporary shelters in gardens, or they themselves would live in natural caves in the hilly areas. So after some time, gradually these monks and nuns felt the need for more permanent shelters, and this is the time when monasteries began to be being built. These came to be known as vihars. So these vihars are the residential places, like shelters for these Buddhist monks and nuns and Jain monks. These viharas were earlier made of wood and then of brick. So later on they came to be built with brick, but earlier they were made of wood. Some viharas were also dug in caves, like you must have seen Ajanta caves. So Ajanta caves also have some vihars. They were dug out in hills, especially in western India. A Buddhist text tells us, so this is a text where a Buddhist text is talking about how people from different sections of society, different part of society, like we saw earlier, that many people and of different occupations, pursuing different occupations and castes of different castes, were allowed to join it, allowed to join the sangh. So it is talking how different rivers flow into a mighty ocean. So similarly, different peoples were coming into sangh, and where their all differences were dissolved. There were no difference. Every rank, varn, family was forgotten. The land on which Vihar was built was donated by a rich merchant or landowner or the king himself, and the local people were used to come with gifts of food, clothing, and medicines for these monks and nuns, and these monks and nuns in return used to teach these people. System of ashrams is related to Brahmins. So actually, if you see, when Jainism and Buddhism is becoming popular, so obviously something was to be done in Hinduism, and so that people would not leave Hinduism. So that's why Brahmins developed a system of ashrams. So this is it in this chapter. Describe the ways in which Buddha tried to spread his message to the people. So that's why I specifically pointed out the story of Kisa Gautami, that Buddha used to encourage people to think for themselves, not just to follow him word by word, but to make them understand the concept. He used to make people more curious about all these concepts of suffering and desires. So this was his idea of teaching. Now you have to tell true or false. The Buddha encouraged animal sacrifice. Obviously no, this is false. He never used to encourage this. He encouraged to be kind to animals and any living being. Sarnath is important because it was the place where the Buddha taught for the first time. Yes, as we said, as we saw earlier, that Sarnath Stoop, the Dhamek Stoop, was also built where to mark this place. The Buddha taught that karma has no effect on our lives. No, he believed in the karma philosophy. The Buddha attained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya in Bihar. True, this is true. In Bihar under the peepal tree. This is related to Upanishad, Mahavir. Do you think it would have been easy for slaves to join the Sangh? What give reasons for answer? What do you think, guys? Obviously, it wouldn't have been easier for the slaves to join the Sangh, because it's not possible that every slave had a kind, generous master, and the masters would have hired them for their own personal works, so they would not allow it for their own convenience. Now we have finished with this chapter 7, and we'll start with this theme 4 of class 12th NCERT part 1. So this is the theme 4. We will be discussing about the cultural developments which were taking place in this period, 600 BC to 600 AD. This is about the people, the philosophers who were living in this period, and how their ideas was being compiled, oral and written, in the both ways. These ideas were also being expressed in architecture and sculptures. We have to be aware about this fact that Buddhism was not being developed in an isolation. Although we are just focusing on Buddhism, but this whole religion was not developing in isolation. There were other traditions, different other philosophies, and different other debates and dialogues which were also taking place during the same period. Now, the large, impressive body of material, the texts, the architectures, the sculptures, monuments, inscriptions, these depict the ideas and beliefs which these philosophers had. And one of the best preserved monuments is this stoop at Sanchi. So this Sanchi is in the state of Bhopal. No, it is in Bhopal, which is in the state of MP, but it is written state of Bhopal because earlier in the time of Shah Jahan Begum, who was Nawab of Bhopal, 1868 and 1901, the Bhopal was a state in itself. So this Sanchi is in Raisen district. It is in Raisen district. So there, at the site, there were stone sculptures and statues of Buddha and an ancient gateway, which was an object of a great interest to European gentlemen, both the French and the English. Major Alexander Cunningham stayed here for several weeks. He was deeply interested in this monument, and he took drawings of the place, deciphered the inscription, and bored shafts down these domes. So, as I said, both the French and the Englishmen both were interested in this monument, and they also requested Shah Jahan Begum to let them take away the eastern gateway. But finally, they had to be content with this plaster cast copies, and the original remained at the site. So finally the eastern gateway was not taken, and it remained at the site only. But they took the plaster cast copies of this gateway. Shah Jahan Begum and her successor Sultan Jahan Begum, they both provided money for the preservation of the ancient site. They funded the museum and they built guest houses. John Marshall, who is a writer who had written his volumes on and described this Sanchi Stoop, has dedicated his important volumes to Sultan Jahan, the Sultan Jahan Begum, who was the successor of Shah Jahan Begum. So if you see, this whole monument just escaped the eyes of railway contractors, builders, and just it was a good luck. There was no, the credit cannot be given to wise decisions or any funding. These two people funded the museum, and they built the guest houses for these people who were writing volumes about this monument. You would have also noticed that we are talking about railway contractors here, because earlier, like if you consider Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, when the railway lines were being laid in that region, the people, the constructors, took out the bricks from these important monuments, and just for the commercial purpose. So uh, these two people were trying to protect these museums, and were funding for their preservation, and now this is preserved by Archaeological Survey of India. So you might have seen this monument on the 200 rupees note. This is actually the stoop number 1, but there are many monuments at the site of Sanchi, which are ranging from different time periods, from Mauryas to Guptas, and also Pushyamitra who belonged from Shung dynasty. So I specifically mentioned Pushyamitra Shung because it is believed that he actually raised this height of the stoop, and also increased the circumference of the diameter of the stoop. Now we will understand about this. Now we will understand the significance of this monument, and why was this mound built in the later part of this text. We'll start with the second section, the background, sacrifices and debates. The background of early Buddhist tradition. We are going to discuss how early Buddhist tradition developed and what was the background for the development. So in the mid first millennium BCE, around the whole world, several thinkers were emerging, such as Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Greece. Greece was like the hub of all these thinkers, and Mahavir and Gautam Buddha in India. So this was the world was going through a turning point, and many thinkers were coming up. These thinkers were trying to understand the concept behind the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. And the society was also changing. The socio-economic life was changing. People were moving to Ganga Valley, as you know, around 1900 BC, and in some books it's written 1600 BC. So the Harappan civilization was declining around this time, and the people had started to move towards the Ganga Valley. So different changes were taking place in India also. The 2.1, the sacrificial tradition. So in Rig Veda, as you see here, while the sacrifices, people used to invoke Agni, the god of fire. He was considered as an intermediary between the people, the subjects, and the god. So in the early Vedic tradition, different hymns were compiled for praising different deities like Agni, Indra, and Som. You can always remember these three by Sia. At first, sacrifices were performed collectively, and later on, people start performing separately. Mainly, the head of the household would perform the sacrifices for the well-being of the domestic unit. And later on, this whole thing will become more personified, more individualistic, and people will go for bhakti movement. That would come in medieval period. But right now, the change that has taken place is that earlier on, the rich people used to perform sacrifices, and then people used to collectively perform sacrifices. But later on, this changed, and the heads of the households started performing sacrifices just for their own domestic unit. More elaborate sacrifices such as the Rajsuya and Ashwamedh sacrifice, where the king depended on the Brahmin priests to conduct the ritual. Ashwamedh sacrifice, you would know that this was a horse sacrifice where the horse was set loose and it was guarded by the king's men. They would be guarding the horse, and the horse would travel the whole kingdom and the other kingdoms of the different other kings. And if the different kings allowed the horse to pass through their territory, then they would accept that the king who is performing the yagya, the Ashwamedh sacrifice, they have like kind of accepted his prominence, and they are accepting that this king was stronger than them. 2.2 New questions. So in Upanishads, people have used to have written about different concepts, and they question death and life after death and the purpose of the sacrifices. So they were also discussing the reasons for rebirth and if rebirth was even possible. Thinkers were concerned with understanding and expressing the nature of the ultimate reality. They were concerned what is ultimate reality, what is the nature of this ultimate reality. They also began to speculate the significance of the sacrificial tradition. So they were also curious about if there was any purpose for this sacrifices they were observing in the society. The debates and discussions 2.3. We get a glimpse of lively discussions and debates from Buddhist texts. These Buddhist texts mention almost 64 sects or schools of thought. So you can see that many schools of thought were developing alongside Buddhism. These people traveled from these teachers belonging to different schools of thought, were traveling from place to place, and they were trying to convince people as well as one another about their philosophies, about their ideas, and about the validity of their ideas and philosophies. So in A.L. Basham, it's written that during this time, ascetics, these are ascetics, these people played a major role in spreading ideas in this time. These were the main people who were spreading these ideas. So debates took place in Kutagar Shala, which is like a hut with a pointed roof, or in some groves where traveling mendicants halted. So mendicants are like beggars. These beggars were also traveling from place to place, and they would also take like kind of participate in these debates in the Kutagar Shala. If a philosopher succeeded in convincing one of his rivals, the followers of the latter also became his disciples. So if I am able to convince you my idea, so you would become my disciple. You would have heard about Milind Panho. There is a book, Milind Panho. I'll write it again, Milind Panho. So this book contains a kind of a dialogue between the king Menander and a Buddhist monk, Nagsen. So this Buddhist monk Nagsen was able to convince this ruler Menander, and the king Menander became a follower, a disciple of the Buddhist monk Nagsen. So this is essentially how the people were expressing themselves, spreading their ideas in that time period. And these teachers also included Mahavir and Buddha, who questioned the authority of the Vedas. They also emphasized individual agency. So like in Hinduism, the agency lied with Brahmins. The Brahmins were the people who would help the kings to perform sacrifices, and they were the people who would tell, like they would classify some people as untouchables, and so basically the agency in Buddhism lied with Brahmins. But the Buddha and Mahavir said that the agency should lie individually, which suggested that men and women could strive to attain liberation from the trials and tribulations of worldly existence. So men and women can themselves, for like kind of make their situation themselves better, and they don't have to rely upon sacrifices and other traditions. As I said, this was in marked contrast to the Brahminical position, whereas we have seen an individual's existence was thought to be determined by his or her birth in a specific caste or gender. So Brahmins uh, made this Varna system, and they said that the people would be decided the people would be classified into groups that was decided on the basis of their birth, and they also classified some people as untouchables. These untouchable people included some craftsmen, some hunters and gatherers, and some people who performed burials and cremations. So these people were burials and cremations. So these people were considered as untouchables by Brahmins. This is the words from Upanishad. So we will be moving forward. How Buddhist texts were prepared and preserved. Buddha actually taught orally. The teachings were never written down. He was only teaching orally through discussions and debates. The men and women of these times attended these discourses and discussed what they heard. They also told different people about the discussions and the debates which were held, and then similarly, like we talked earlier, that this is how the dissemination of the ideas was taking place. People were discussing, let me write it, dissemination of ideas was taking place like this. People were discussing these with different people and convincing each other. After the death of Buddha, which was in 5th to 4th century BC, his teachings were compiled by his disciples at a council of elders or senior monks at Vesali, which is a Pali word for Vaishali. This is in Bihar. These compilations were known as Tripitak. Tripitak means 3 baskets. These baskets are meant to hold different types of texts. So this is the literal meaning of Tripitak. They were first transmitted orally. So Tripitak was also transmitted orally, but later on it was written and classified according to length as well as subject matter. So in the later times when it was written down, it was classified according to its subject matter as well as length. The Vinay Pitak included rules and regulations for those who joined the Sangh of monastic order. So like we saw in class 6th NCERT, Vinay Pitak was supposed to hold the rules and regulations for the Buddhist Sangh. The Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitak. So Sutta Pitak contained Buddha's teachings, and philosophical matters were discussed in Abhidhamma Pitak. These were the 3 books which are termed as Tipitak. Each Pitak comprised a number of individual texts. Later on, commentaries were written on these texts by Buddhist scholars. Different Buddhist scholars came up and they wrote commentaries on these 3 books. When Buddhism started spreading into different regions, like new regions like Sri Lanka, new books were written like Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa were written, which contained the regional histories of Buddhism. So these two, like the Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa, contained the regional history of Buddhism of Sri Lanka. Many of these works contain biographies of the Buddha. Some of the older texts are in Pali, while later compositions are in Sanskrit. So this is very important, that The older texts were written in Pali, but later compositions were written in Sanskrit. And in the class 6th NCRT, we also read that Buddha used to teach in common language, which was Prakrit. This is very important. 3 languages have been mentioned, and we have to remember that the Buddha teachings were in Prakrit, the texts were in Pali, and the later compositions of Buddhist texts were in Sanskrit. When Buddhism spread to East Asia, pilgrims such as Fayan and Xuanzang traveled all the way from China. They came from China to India to see these texts. They also wanted to take these texts to China. These they took back to their own country. Yes, they took back some of these texts to their own country, where they were translated by scholars. Different scholars in China translated them into Chinese language. Indian Buddhist teachers also traveled to faraway places carrying texts to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha. जो Now the Buddhist texts have been preserved in manuscripts for several centuries in monasteries in different parts of Asia. Modern translations have been prepared from Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese and Tibetan texts. This is a Buddhist manuscript in Sanskrit. The Fatalists and the Materialists. This is an excerpt from Sutta Pitak. As we read, the Sutta Pitak contained the teachings of Buddha. This excerpt is a conversation between the king Ajatasattu, who was the ruler of Magad, and Buddha. Ajatasattu is also known as Ajatashatru. So this king Ajatasattu is asking Buddha about teaching of another teacher who was named Makhali Gosal. So this Makhali Gosal belonged to the tradition of the Ajivikas, which these people have been described as fatalists, the people who believed in fate. So for them, the philosophy was like, even if your deeds are good or bad, it will not modify your future. Your karma can be good and bad, but at the end, the fool and the wise alike will take their course and make an end of sorrow. So you cannot change your future. At the end, you have to die, and the pleasure and pain cannot be altered. This is what fatalists, the people belonging to the Ajivika tradition, believed in. And then there's this another philosopher named Ajit Kesh Kambalin, and he belonged to the tradition of Lokayats. These people were usually described as materialists. These people believed in materialism. This is what these excerpts are talking about. Now we'll move to, this is Beyond Worldly Pleasures, the message of Mahavir. This is related to Jainism. Let's move ahead. The Buddha and the quest for enlightenment. As Buddha was a very influential teacher, his ideas, his messages spread across the subcontinent as well as to different countries like Central Asia, to China, Korea and Japan. Also we saw Deepvamsa and Mahavamsa of Sri Lanka, then to Myanmar, Thailand and Indonesia. So how do we know about the Buddha's teachings? We know them because they have been compiled in Sutta Pitak, but also we know about them due to hagiographies. These historians have also tried to reconstruct details of his life from hagiographies. What are hagiographies? Hagiographies are actually a biography of a certain saint or religious leader. These hagiographies praise the saint's achievements and may not always be literally accurate. So this is like a trend in the earlier times. People used to write down exaggerated information about the person who they believed in or the kings they wanted to follow. So the information mentioned cannot be literally accurate, but these were often, the hagiographies were often written to praise the saints' achievements. So Siddharth was his name at birth, and he was a son of a chief of the Shakya clan, so of a Shakya Gan. This is Gan. He had a sheltered upbringing within the palace. He was far away from the harsh realities of life. He didn't know much about poverty and being ill and death. So once he went into the city with his charioteer and he was seeing the city, there he encountered an old man, a sick man, and a corpse. So finally he saw the poverty, the illness, and also came to know about death. So it is in this moment that he knew that the destruction of the human body was inevitable and death cannot be avoided. He also saw a homeless mendicant. We know mendicant is a beggar. He also saw a homeless beggar who had come to terms with his old age, disease, and death and found peace. So this made him realize that these are the things which are inevitable, and he decided that he would adopt the same path where he would also be at peace with this poverty, illness, and death. He started wandering. He came out of the comforts of his house and he started wandering the world in search of his own truth. He explored several paths, including bodily mortification, which led him to a situation of near death. So he also, like people in earlier times, it's mentioned in A.L. Basham again that some people in the earlier times used to undergo different sorts of physical tortures. This was their way of they thought that they could become enlightened after this sort of torture. After this, he came to be known as the Buddha or the enlightened one. Not after the torture, but after the meditation for several days. For the rest of his life, he taught Dham or the path of righteous living. So, what is Dham? Dham is the path of righteous living. This is a sculpture from Amravati, which is depicting his departure from the comforts of his house. It is also known as Mahabhinishkraman. This is also known as Mahabhinishkraman or the Great Departure. Like the moment he renunciated all the comforts and all the luxuries and decided to follow his own truth. So the fifth part is the teachings of the Buddha. Since Buddha was a very influential teacher, his teachings have been reconstructed mainly in Sutta Pitaka, and people used to believe that Buddha had miraculous powers and he would display these supernatural powers to convince people. But most people suggest that Buddha tried to convince people through reason and persuasion. So he was using discussions, debates, and reasons to convince people rather than displaying supernatural powers. For instance, when a grief-stricken woman came to him after his child's death, and Buddha convinced her about the inevitability of death. She asked Buddha to bring his son back to life, but Buddha asked her to bring mustard seeds from a house of a family where nobody has died. So this is how, like, when she couldn't find any house, obviously there is no house where no one has died. So finally she understood the inevitability of death, and this is how Buddha used to teach people. This was his way of teaching. These stories were narrated. Actually, we have learned about this story in the 6th class NCRT. This grief-stricken woman is actually the same Kissa Gautami. Now, according to Buddhist philosophy, the world is transient, anicca. The word anicca is transient. It is constantly changing. It is soulless. There is no soul in it, so it is anat. And nothing is permanent or eternal in it because it is constantly changing. And this transient world where humans are living, they have sorrows, which is dukh, and this sorrow is very intrinsic, which is actually the human beings themselves have manifested. It is their own creation. If they won't have any desires, there won't be any sorrow for them. So to, like, we read about the word tanha, which is a desire or thirst. To eliminate this, we have to follow the path of moderation, not extremities but moderation. Extremities, the path of extremities have been emphasized in Jainism. So we have to follow the path of moderation between severe penance and self-indulgence, and then the human beings will be able to rise above these worldly troubles. The existence of God was quite irrelevant in Buddhism. So Buddhism was not concerned with the existence of God. Buddhism in practice. This is an excerpt from Sutta Pitak, where Buddha is giving an advice to a wealthy householder named Sigal. So basically, in this excerpt, the Buddha is trying to teach Sigal about how a master should treat his servant and how a clansman should look after the needs of samanas. So this word is important. Samanas are the ones who have renounced the world, who are roaming around begging for food and maybe teaching their own ideas. So he is teaching this wealthy householder Sigal about like how he should treat the servants, how he should treat these samanas he encounters in his lives. So now the Buddha regarded the social world as creation of humans. It was not of divine origin, but the world was itself created by the humans. So he gave advices to kings and Gahapatis to be human and ethical. These kings should be generous and kind to their subjects and should be ethical in their doings. Individual effort was expected to transform social relations. So if you want to transform the social relations, you have to put individual effort, according to Buddha. As we already saw, Buddha emphasized individual agency. How can the individual agency be emphasized? Through righteous actions. And through righteous actions, you can escape from the cycle of rebirth and attain self-realization and Nibbana, which is also known as Nirvana. So you have to gain individual agency and righteous action, individual agency, righteous action, and this will help you to escape the cycle of rebirth, and you can attain self-realization and Nirvana, which is literally the extinguishing of the ego. This is very important. This is the literal meaning of the word Nirvana. Extinguishing of the ego and desire. I'm sorry, I'll highlight it whole. Extinguishing of the ego and the desires, and thus end the cycle of suffering for those who renounce the world. The people who have renounced the world are samanas. And we also word tanha. You can revise it like this. Followers of the Buddha. So now the Buddha was gaining disciples with the time, and gradually several disciples started to follow him. An organization of monks also became teachers of this Dhamma. The Sangh became an organization of monks And these monks also became teachers of Dham, which was already being taught by Buddha. So how did these monks lived in those times? They lived very simply. They only possessed essential requirements for survival, essential requisites for survival, such as a bowl to receive food. They would beg for food and they would just carry a bowl with them. And they lived on alms. They were known as bhikkhus, and the women among the nuns were known as bhikkhunis. As I said earlier, initially only men were allowed into the Sangh. Only men were allowed into Sangh. But later on, women also came to be admitted. There is this text, a Buddhist text, where it is said that with the mediation of Anand, who was Buddha's most important disciple, so with his mediation, he was the one who kind of persuaded Buddha to allow women into Sangh. The Buddha's foster mother, Mahapajapati Gautami, was the first woman to be ordained as a bhikkhuni. So this was she was the foster mother of Gautam Buddha, and she was the first woman who became bhikkhuni. Many women who entered the Sangh became teachers of Dham and went on to become Theris. There is a text known as Theri Gatha. So Theri Gatha contains verses from Buddhist nuns. So you can remember it like this, that these bhikkhunis, the ones who joined Sangh and started teaching Dham, they were the ones who became Theris. And remember the word Theri Gatha. The followers of Buddha were from various social groups. As we have seen earlier, people of different occupations, of different castes, of different genders started following Buddha, and they were admitted into the Sangh. Kings, wealthy men, Gehpatis, humbler folk, workers, slaves, and craftspeople. There were some rules about how they could join the Sangh, but everyone was admitted. Once within the Sangh, all were regarded as equal. As we also saw earlier a text where it was said that many rivers join a mighty ocean. Similarly, people from different castes, people pursuing different occupations, flowed into the group and the association called Sangh, and there they all dissolved their differences. They all came to be regarded as equal. The internal functioning of the Sangh was based on the tradition of Ganas and Sanghas. This is what I was saying, that I think Buddha, as he belonged to the Vaji Sangh, he took some of the organizational structure of the republics and applied to the Sanghs he formed for his followers and disciples, where consensus was based on the traditions of Ganas and Sanghs, where consensus was arrived at through discussions. So in earlier republics also, people used to gather, hold meetings for discussions during the time of peace and war, and also to take certain measures. If that failed, decisions were taken by a vote on the subject. As I talked about the Theri Gatha are the verses composed by the Theris, the elder nuns, the bhikkhunis, and this is just a kind of a poem where a dasi or a slave woman named Pun is describing her experience. So this is not important, but what is important is that Theri Gatha actually belong to the tradition of Theravada Buddhism. It is easy to learn because Theri and Theravada, Therigatha and Theravada are kind of similar. So there is this Pali canon, which is like the standard collection of scriptures in the Theravada Buddhism. So these are the scriptures which belong to the Theravada Buddhist religion. And so in Pali canon, the Therigatha is classified as Khuddaka Nikaya. And this Khuddaka Nikaya is part of Khuddaka Nikaya, and this is part of Sutta Pitaka. So as you can see, we start from Sutta Pitaka, then there's Khuddaka Nikaya, and Khuddaka Nikaya is under Khuddaka Nikaya is Therigatha. Now this is a woman water carrier, Mathura, 3rd century CE, 3rd century AD. This is a sculpture from Mathura. Rules for monks and nuns, which were written in Vinay Pitaka. There were many rules about them, like there were rules regarding how to store salt also, and how to arrive at a family residence, how to accept the food. But we don't have to learn all those rules, so we only have to know where these rules were laid down, and that was in Vinay Pitaka. Buddhism grew rapidly both during the lifetime and also after his death. So Buddhism kept on growing after the death of Buddha also. And it appealed to many people who were dissatisfied with their own religion, and with their existing religious practices in their religion, and confused by the rapid social changes. So this was an effort by the teachers who were teaching Dhamma to convince people who were already dissatisfied with the religious practices in their religion, or they were very confused with the social changes taking place in the society. The importance attached to conduct and values rather than claims of superiority based on birth, the emphasis placed on metta, that is a fellow feeling, and karuna. We have to place special attention on these two words, metta and karuna. These are the two feelings of these are the two terms where emphasis has been placed in Buddhism. So this kind of this grew people's interest into this religion, and people were attracted to this religion, where you can join the religious structure. You can join from any caste or any gender, and you don't have to rely on the superiority of the birth or the inferiority of the birth. This is how Buddhism gained prominence at this time. Now the seventh part is stupas. So we have seen that Buddhist ideas and practices emerged out of a process of dialogues and debates, and with other these dialogues and debates were conducted with other traditions like Brahmins, Jains, and several others, like Ajivikas and Lokayat philosophy. All ideas have not been preserved in text, but some of these interactions have been preserved in texts, like I talked about Milind Panho earlier. So this is also an interaction which has been preserved as a text. So in earlier times, people tend to regard certain places as sacred. So this was a tendency among the people of earlier times, that they used to consider some places as sacred, and they used to find some sites which would have special trees, unique rocks, and these places were of very they had natural beauty, and so they would build some small shrines in these sites, and these shrines would be called as chaityas. So chaitya, what is chaitya? It is derived from the word chita, which means, we all know in Hindi what chita means, a funeral pyre, and by extension of a funerary mound. So these people built shrines which were uh, termed as chaitya. So Buddhist literature, these texts mention several chaityas, and these places are associated with the important life events of Buddha, like the first sermon in Sarnath. So you can find in Sarnath. Then Lumbini was the place associated with the birth of Buddha, and Kushinara, or the Kushinagar. Kushinara is also known as Kushinagar. So this is the place where Buddha passed away. Then Bodh Gaya, where he attained enlightenment. Bharhut, this is where Bharhut Stup is there, located here, and which is made of green schist. You can remember that, green schist. And Sanchi Stoop, as we read about Sanchi Stoop earlier, it is now a World Heritage Site. Then Ajanta Caves, Karle Caves in Pune. So Ajanta Caves and Karle Caves, as you can see, these places are of natural beauty. These caves have been dug in hilly areas, and so this was the tendency in earlier people, where they would find places with unique rocks or inspiring natural beauty. So these Buddhist literature mention places associated with Buddha's life, where he was born, Lumbini, and he attained enlightenment, Bodh Gaya, gave his first sermon in Sarnath, and he attained Nibbana, where he passed away, Kushinagar. So all these places came to be regarded as sacred. We know that about 200 years after the time of the Buddha, Ashok erected a pillar at Lumbini. So Ashok has erected a pillar at Lumbini to mark the fact that he had visited the place. So Ashok visited the place, he visited the village Lumbini, and he erected a pillar over there. This is an excerpt from Mahaparinibbar Sutta. So there is Sutta, Mahaparinibban Sutta, which is a part of Sutta Pitak, and this will discuss why were stupas built. So these stupas were built. So what was their purpose? When Buddha was dying, his favorite disciple Anand asked him, "What are we to do, Lord, with the remains of the Tathagat?" Sorry, it is Tathagat. So Tathagat is also another name of Buddha. Anand is asking what we have to do with your body, and what should be the further actions they have to take. Buddha replies that don't worry yourselves by honoring my remains, and just be zealous and intent on your own good. At the four crossroads, they should erect a thoop, which is a Pali word for stoop. So you have to erect a stoop at four crossroads. So we will now discuss 7.1, why were stupas built. There were other places too that were regarded as sacred. These were sacred because these places contain relics of Buddha. As you saw, his remains were taken to these places. And mounds were built on these bodily remains, and these mounds came to be known as stupas. And the Pali word is stupa. The tradition of erecting stupas may have been pre-Buddhist. If you have read about megalithic culture, people used to build mounds on the burial sites. So this is a very pre-Buddhist tradition. But the tradition of erecting stupas actually came to be associated with Buddhism. Now these stupas are not just mounds actually. If you visit Sanchi Stoop or Sarnath Stoop, even on Sarnath Stoop, there are engravings of human forms, like there are many engravings and paintings, and also there are inscriptions in Brahmi script. So these just not remained a mound, they were adorned with different features as well. According to the Buddhist text, which is Ashok Vadan, Ashok distributed portions of Buddha's relics to very important towns. So these relics of Buddha were distributed by Ashok, and these relics were taken to very important towns, and stupas were constructed over them. By the 2nd century BC, number of stupas like that in Bharut, Sanchi and Sarnath, these had been built. 7.2, how were stupas built? Now we have seen why were they built. They were built to house the relics of Buddha. Now we'll see how they were built. The inscriptions are found on the railings and pillars of stupas. As I said, they were decorated with these adornments, these paintings, these engravings, and these inscriptions. Donations were made by kings, such as kings belonging to the Satvahan dynasty. Also, they were very rich tradesmen, and they were rich ivory workers who financed the gateways at Sanchi. We have earlier seen that Eastern Gateway was an object of fascination for the French and the English people. So these gateways were financed by rich ivory workers, and hundreds of donations were made by women and men who mentioned their names, sometimes adding the name of the place from where they came. Bhikkhus and bhikkhunis also contributed towards building these monuments. So there was this overall contribution from different people from of different belonging to different strata of the society, rich and poor and rich tradesmen, as well as common people, as well as the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis who were just living on alms and begging for food. So this is how stupas were built with collective effort. The structure of the stupa. Stupa is a Sanskrit word meaning a heap, which is mound. It originated as a simple semicircular mound of earth, later called and. And gradually the structure started to become more complex, balancing round and square shapes. So actually in earlier times it was just this semicircular mound of earth, but later on the structure became more complex. Gateways were being added here, and then some pathways were being added. It was mounted on a square shaped platform. So this is how the structure came to started becoming more complex. Above the and was the hermika, a balcony like structure that represented the abode of the god. So abode is like a dwelling place. So according to these people, hermika was the place where gods were supposed to live, or this was the place where gods were housed. Now this is a inscription from Sanchi, and such similar inscriptions all have been found at Bharut and Amravati. There are stupas in Bharut also, and there is a stupa at Amravati also. So similar inscriptions have been found from those stupas also. So, arising from Harmika was a mast called the Yashti, often surmounted by a chhatri or umbrella. Around the mound was a railing separating the sacred space from the secular world. So, the mound, the railing actually, is separating the sacred space of Harmika from the secular world. Let me show you this in a drawing I have drawn, because the Mauryan sculpture and the architecture was actually very much related to Buddhism. It was influenced by Buddhism a lot. So we can see this. This is the rectangular raised pavilion which is supposed to be the abode of gods, and then this is Chhatravali that is being talked about. Now there is And, this is the hemispherical dome. This is Pradakshina Path, like people used to go around this stoop like this hemispherical dome, and this Pradakshina Path is a circumambulatory path, and these are the railings which are known as Vedika. So this separated this sacred place from the secular world. These are the Toran. Toran are the gateways. This is the architecture of stoop. Also, as you have seen that Ashoka had visited Lumbini and erected a pillar over there. So this was the structure of an Ashokan pillar. The most upper part is known as animal figurine. Like there was an animal figure of a lion, or there could be an elephant or different other animals, and then there was this abacus on which this animal figurine was sitting. After below the abacus was an inverted lotus bell capital. This was known as capital, and it was shaped as an inverted lotus bell. This is a monolithic shaft made from same piece of rock, and this was the base. This was same piece of rock, monolithic, and these pillars had a very glossy finish and used to contain different orders for people, or some advices from the King Ashok. This is how he constructed these pillars. Now coming back to this is a very big chapter actually. Now we'll come to early stupas at Sanchi and Bharhut were plain except for the stone railings. So the early stup were very plain and they resembled a bamboo or wooden fence, and the gateways were richly carved and installed at the 4 cardinal points. Those were known as toran, as you saw. Worshippers entered through the eastern gateway and walked around the mound in a clockwise direction. Later, the mound of the stupas came to be elaborately carved with niches and sculptures, as at Amravati and Shahji Ki Dheri in Peshawar, Pakistan. So this is also important that there is a stup in Pakistan which is known as Shahji Ki Dheri. This is the top view of a great stupa at Sanchi, and this is how we have already seen the whole structure. This was how they were built. Discovering stupas, the 8th part, the fate of Amravati and Sanchi. Let us see this sculpture. The eastern gateway that was talked about earlier, for which French were taking permission from Shah Jahan Begum. They wanted to take away to France. Each stup has a history of its own. They have their own histories. In 1796, there was this local Raja who wanted to build a temple on the ruins of the stoop at Amravati. So he decided to use the stones of these ruins. He was going to use the stones of the ruins of the stoop and thought there might be some treasure buried in what seemed to be a hill. This seemed to be a hill to him, so he wanted to see if there was treasure buried. There was this British official who was named Colin Mackenzie. He visited the site and found several pieces of sculptures, and he started drawing them. He made detailed drawings, but his reports were never published. In 1854, Walter Elliot, the commissioner of Guntur, which is in Andhra Pradesh, now he visited Amravati and he collected several sculpture panels and he took them to Madras. So this is like in 1796, where the stoop is already in its ruins and is being further kind of damaged. It is being damaged further by this local Raja, and then Colin Mackenzie, who is a British official, visits the site. He does some detailed drawings, but his reports are never published. But in 1854, there is Commissioner Walter Elliot, who is the commissioner of Guntur, and he visits Amravati, collects some sculpture panels and takes them to Madras. He also discovered the remains of Western Gateway. So he found the remains of Western Gateway, and he concluded that Amravati was one of the largest and most magnificent Buddhist stoop ever built. So this was his conclusion, that Amravati was the largest and the most magnificent Buddhist stoop ever built. By the 1850s now, slabs from Amravati had been taken to different places, to the Asiatic Society of Bengal at Calcutta, to the Indian office in Madras, and some even to London. So these panels and these sculptures had been taken to different places, for people wanted to study them. They were interested in it. So the new officials in these areas continued to remove sculptures from the site, because the earlier officials had also done the same. So these new officials were also taking sculptures from this site. This is further damaging the whole structure, which was now remaining there. Now comes H.H. Cole, an archaeologist. He wrote that it seems to me a suicidal and indefensible policy to allow the country to be looted of original works of ancient art. So he was against this, what these earlier officials, these British officials were doing. He said that this is very suicidal and it cannot be defended, that the country is being looted the country is being deprived of the original works, the genuine works which have been built over the time period. He believed that museums should have plaster cast facsimiles of sculpture, like we saw the French took the plaster cast copies of the Eastern Gateway. So this is what H.H. Cole also believed in, that we should not take the original sculpture or the panel to different countries, but we should rather take plaster cast facsimiles of the sculpture, whereas the originals should remain where they have been found. Unfortunately, Cole did not succeed in convincing the authorities, which is highly possible that the authorities will not be convinced by this idea, and British officials continued taking all these sculptures to their own countries or to different places for studying them. Although his plea for in situ preservation was adopted in the case of Sanchi. So in Sanchi, at site preservation was adopted. Why did Sanchi survive while Amravati did not? This is obviously very obvious now, that Sanchi's stoop could survive but Amravati could not survive, although it is being rebuilt now. Perhaps Amravati was discovered before scholars understood the values of the finds and realized how critical it was to preserve things. So this is the obviously this is the reason why Amravati could not survive. It could not be preserved. 1818 In 1818, Sanchi was discovered, and three of its four gateways were still standing. The fourth was lying on the spot where it had fallen, and the mound was in good condition. Mahachatya at Amravati is now just an insignificant little mound, totally denuded of its former glory. So Sanchi could survive, has still survived, and Amravati was denuded of its former glory, and has just remained as a ruin now. This is a section of the gateway. Do you think the sculptures at Sanchi wanted to depict a scroll being unfurled? So there's this painting, and the text is asking about certain painting. Sculpture. The ninth part is sculpture. We have just seen how sculptures were removed from stoop and transported all the way to Europe. This was because these people considered these panels, these sculptures to be very beautiful and valuable, and they wanted to possess them. They wanted to keep all these for themselves. So, stories on stone. In present time also, you can see people carrying some scrolls, the charan chitras of cloth or paper where some paintings have been done. If you look at the figure 4.13, this is the figure. Here, this is if you see, you will think that this is a scene from a rural village, depicting a very rural life. But when historians studied this sculpture very carefully, they identified it as a scene from Vesantar Jatak. Vesantar Jatak, and it consists of a story about a generous prince who actually gave up all his wealth and moved to forest to live with his wife and children, and gave all his wealth and everything to a Brahmin. So this sculpture is found at the northern gateway of Sanchi. Historians often try to understand the meaning of sculpture by comparing it with textual evidence. So you have this textual evidence, and then you have these sculptures, architectural forms. Now the historians, what they do is they compare the information on both these. They would compare these both, and then they would come to a conclusion. So Vesantar Jatak, in the text of Vesantar Jatak, a story was written about a generous prince, and when they compared it with this painting, with this engravings on the northern gateway of Sanchi, they could establish a connection between the story mentioned in Vesantar Jatak. 9.2 Symbols of worship. Art historians had to acquire familiarity with hagiographies of the Buddha in order to understand Buddhist sculpture. So this is what they exactly are doing. They are seeing Buddhist sculptures, and they are matching their information from the textual evidences, which can be Buddhist texts, which can be hagiographies which have been written to praise Buddha. So they are matching and confirming the information. According to hagiographies, the Buddha attained enlightenment while meditating under a tree. The early sculptors did not show Buddha in human form. Obviously, this is the part of Theravada Buddhism. He is never depicted in the form of a human. So different symbols were used to show his presence, like an empty seat, which indicated meditation of Buddha. Then there was this stoop, which represents Mahaparinibban. Mahaparinibban is the passing away of Buddha. Stoop is chosen for this because these are the mounds which are housing the relics. So they are used to show Mahaparinibban. Another symbol is wheel, which actually shows the first sermon, which was given at Sarnath. Now let's see these pictures. these people are worshipping the Bodhi tree, and there is tree but there is no Buddha over there. So this is an empty seat. Empty seat will show this that Buddha is meditating. He is in meditation. Now this is here people are worshipping the stoop. Now you see that stoop is this can be also concluded that this painting could have been done after the death of Buddha, because stoop denotes passing away of Buddha. This is the wheel, which is to show the first sermon which was delivered at Sarnath. So this is how symbols were used, and people used to worship these symbols in Theravada Buddhism, which is the oldest form of Buddhism. As is obvious, such sculptures cannot be understood literally. For instance, the tree does not stand simply for a tree. So here the tree is also denoting enlightenment. So if you consider it, the historians have to compare the information, and then they will come to understand that this tree is showing enlightenment, and it is not just literally a tree. And they would be able to understand every symbol if they would compare it with the life of the Buddha. 9.3 Popular traditions. Other sculptures at Sanchi were perhaps not directly inspired by Buddhist ideas. So there are other sculptures also which are not at all relevant to Buddhism. There is a woman swinging from the edge of the gateway, holding on to a tree. This is described in Sanskrit as Shalbhanjika. So there was this popular belief that this was a woman whose touch caused trees to flower and bear fruit. So this is not relevant to Buddhism. Shalbhanjika. A woman whose touch can cause trees to flower and bear fruit. The Shalbhanjika motif suggests that many people who turned to Buddhism enriched it with their own pre-Buddhist and even non-Buddhist beliefs, practices and ideas. As we have seen earlier, Buddhist teachers, the monks, the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis, they used to teach people and tried to convince them about their philosophies and ideas. And they focused on the people who were quite dissatisfied with their own religion. So when these dissatisfied people joined Buddhism, they came with their own pre-Buddhist or even non-Buddhist beliefs. And Shalbhanjika motif is kind of denoting these people. There are certain other images as well. They are quite very many of them are of animals, which include elephants, horses, monkeys and cattle. Jatakas, these are the stories which are related to previous lives of Buddha. So Buddha had previous lives, and these previous lives have been written about in Jatak stories, lives of Buddha. So these animal stories have been depicted at Sanchi. Elephants were also example of strength and wisdom. So these animals have been carved to draw viewers also, and to decorate the railings and the sculpture structure. Paintings from the past. This is a painting from Ajanta. This is a person who is sitting over there and people are serving him. So, stone sculpture survives the ravages of time. These have been built into these paintings have been done into the caves, so they have survived the ravages of the time, and we can still observe them and enjoy the visual creativity. These are the visual means of communication, and those which have survived the best are from Ajanta, which is in Maharashtra, and these are the most famous also because obviously Ajanta is also a World Heritage Site. The paintings at Ajanta depict the stories from the Jatak Kathaएं you would have heard of. So these Ajanta paintings are from Jatak stories. These also include depiction of courtly life, the life in the royal courts, processions, men and women at work and festivals. So people would be coming out in processions on certain events or festivals, or people were doing some work. So this all is depicted on the walls of Ajanta caves. Shading technique has been used to give a 3D quality, and these paintings are extremely naturalistic. So now we can see the paintings. This is Gajalakshmi. This is painting from Ajanta, and this is a serpent at Sanchi. So a woman surrounded by lotus and elephants. As you see, this is Gajalakshmi. She is surrounded by elephants and lotus. Elephants, lotus, and they are sprinkling water on her as if performing an abhishek. So the historians have identified this figure as Maya. Maya was mother of Buddha. There was foster mother of Buddha, and this is the real mother of Buddha. And some people, historians have identified as Maya, but some people identify this figure as a popular goddess known as Gajalakshmi, which means goddess of good fortune, and this popular goddess is associated with elephants. And it is also possible that people can identify this sculpture as both as Maya and Gajalakshmi. So Maya and Gajalakshmi, some people regard both as same. Now this serpent sculpture at Sanchi, like this one, is found on several pillars. It is standing on several pillars. This motif seems to be derived from popular traditions, which is not recorded in text. So the textual evidence is not there. One of the earliest modern art historians, like James Ferguson, considered Sanchi to be the center of a tree and serpent worship. So according to James Ferguson, the Sanchi site was the place where tree and serpents were worshipped. He was not familiar with Buddhist literature, as he was not familiar because most of it had not been translated. So he came to his own conclusion and considered Sanchi to be a center of tree and serpent worship. New religious traditions, part 10th. The development of Mahayana Buddhism. So we till now we were studying about Theravada Buddhism, but now we will study about Mahayana Buddhism. So around 1st century AD, that is also CE, there are evidences of changes in Buddhist ideas and practices. People started adopting different practices. They started having different beliefs. So, but earlier Buddhist teachings, they emphasized on self-effort in achieving Nibbana. So Buddha always emphasized on personal agency, like individual agency, and he always emphasized on self-effort to achieve Nibbana. And Buddha himself was regarded as a human being who attained enlightenment and Nibbana through his own efforts. But this concept of self-effort gradually declined, and an idea of a savior, this idea of savior emerged with time. It was believed that this savior would ensure salvation. Salvation is like moksha. So this savior would ensure moksha or salvation for these people, and simultaneously the concept of bodhisattva was developed. Now bodhisattvas are these people, these deeply compassionate beings who themselves have attained Nibbana through their own effort. So these people have already attained Nibbana through their own effort, but they are not leaving this world yet. They haven't left, they are not leaving the world, but they are remaining behind to help the others attain Nibbana. So these are the saviors who remain behind, who are not leaving the world even after attaining Nibbana, and they are here to help others to attain the Nibbana. And Nibbana is the annihilation of ego and desires. So worship of images of Buddha and Bodhisattva became an important part of this tradition. As seen in Theravada Buddhism, the Buddha was never worshipped in a form of an image, or he asked that his teachings were to be followed, and he himself was never to be worshipped. But in the tradition which was developing after 1st century AD, we can see that people started worshipping Buddha as well as bodhisattvas. This new way of thinking was called Mahayana, literally the great vehicle. And these people who believed in such practices, they considered themselves superior. So they were the greater version of, they were following the greater version. So this was called Mahayana Buddhism. And the people who were still believing in the older tradition were following Heenyan, or the lesser vehicle. So what is the difference between Heenyan or Theravada? What is the difference between Heenyan and Theravada? So Mahayana actually regarded other Buddhists as followers of Heenyan, and the followers who were actually following the teachings given by Buddha and following the older tradition, they themselves described themselves as Theravadins. So actually both are same. The Theravadins and the Heenyan followers are same, but the Theravadins are called people of Heenyan religion by the people following Mahayana religion. I hope it is not confusing for you. The teachers are called Theras, the female teachers are called Theri. Now let's look at this painting. This is an image of Buddha from Mathura, and this is from 1st century AD. So you can see there is quite a difference now in the painting. The earlier paintings were beautiful, but they were sort of crude. But now the paintings have some well-defined structure, and the features are quite different also. The growth of Puranic Hinduism. This is related to Hinduism. And Durga, Garbhagriha, Shikhar. Can we see everything? So here this is important, that early scholars, they tried to make sense of these strange images they were observing on these sculptures, and they would compare them from the sculptures they could see in ancient Greece. Usually they thought that this Indian sculpture was inferior to the works of Greek artists, but when they saw these images of Buddha and Bodhisattva that were evidently based on Greek models, so they quite became excited and interested to study these. These were most often found in northwest areas, the areas of Takshila and Peshawar, and where Indo-Greek rulers, obviously these Indo-Greek rulers would have been influenced by the Greek culture and the Greek sculptures. So these were the ones who embodied these features into the Indian sculpture and into the sculptures of Buddha and Bodhisattvas. These Indo-Greek rulers established kingdoms in the 2nd century BC. So these images were closest to the Greek statues, and scholars were familiar with it. These historians, these foreign scholars who were already who were familiar with these kind of sculptures, they quite became interested into these. This is a Bodhisattva from Gandhar. So you can notice the hairstyle and the clothes, the drapes you can see. So this was never this is kind of a very Indo-Greek sculpture. The pure Indian sculptures don't have these drapes, so this was very different. Now we have come to the end, and here you can see during the 6th century BC, early Upanishads and Jainism and Buddhism, these all were developing simultaneously, these all were coexisting. 3rd century BC, around 3rd century BC, first stupas were built, and 2nd century BC onwards, Mayan Buddhism started developing. And in 1989, Sanchi was declared a World Heritage Site. Discuss the role of the Begums of Bhopal in preserving the stupa at Sanchi. We have seen that they were funding the preservation and funding the establishment of museum, and also funding the stay at guest houses of these scholars and historians who were writing about these monuments. Now read this short inscription and answer. In the year 33 of the Maharaja Hovishk, Kushan ruler, in the first month of the hot season, on the 8th day, a bodhisattva was set up at Madhuvanak by the Bhikkhuni Dhanavati, the sister's daughter of the Bhikkhuni Buddhamita, who knows the Tipitak, the female pupil of the Bhikkhu Bal, who knows the Tipitak, together with the father and mother. How did Dhanvati date her inscription? So she is using all these relatives, the name of relatives and her relation, and also the ruler which is ruling at the time she is writing this inscription. Why do you think she installed an image of the Bodhisattva? Because this is the year 33 and people had begun to start believing in the concept of Bodhisattva, and they used to worship Bodhisattva. Who were the relatives she mentioned? So she has mentioned different relatives. We don't have to know all that. What Buddhist text did she know? She know Tipitak. From whom did she learn this text? From Bhikkhu, she was a pupil of Bhikkhu Bal. So like Bhikkhus used to travel to different places to teach people. Why do you think women and men joined the Sangh? So Sangh was a group formed by people who had left their homes, and they collectively joined this Sangh and followed Buddhist teaching. To what extent does knowledge of Buddhist literature help in understanding the sculpture at Sanchi? As we have already discussed, Buddhist texts mention Sanchi, and they can also help to understand the engravings and the paintings done at the walls and the railings of these of the sculptures of the Sanchi, and so historians can confirm the information. Discuss how and why stup were built. They were built by collective effort, and they were built to house relics of Buddha. And this is it. The 12th NCERT has been done. A.L. Basham, I would be sharing my personal notes, because this is a very important book to understand Buddhism, and UPSC does question some some relevant topics from this book. So I would share my personal notes in the part 2nd of this. We have seen this features of modern art, and which have a definite relationship with Buddhism. Now let's do the previous year questions on Buddhism. In 1996, it was asked that what is common to both Jainism and Buddhism. These are the 4 points: avoidance of extremities of penance and enjoyment. So, extremities of pain and pleasure, indifference to the authority of the Vedas, denial of efficacy of rituals, non injury to animal life. So, second, third, and fourth, this is common to both Jainism and Buddhism. Avoidance of extremities of penance and enjoyment is relevant to Buddhism because you have to avoid extremities and follow moderation, but in Jainism, you have to practice extreme penance. Now, the second question: which of the following sculptures was invariably used green schist as the medium? That is Bharut sculptures. In Mahayana Buddhism, the next question is Mahayana Buddhism, Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvar was also known as. So he was also known as Padmapani. Now, this was asked in 1997, and now we can see additional information about this. What do you understand by the term Bodhisattvas? We have seen earlier that these are the compassionate beings who have already attained Nibbana. They have this Bodhichitta. Bodhichitta is like having a kind heart. So they have attained Nibbana, but they are remaining behind to help others. Name some prominent Bodhisattvas and their prominent traits. So there is this Avalokiteshvar. He is one of the 3 protective deities around Buddha. He is holding lotus flower and is also known as Padmapani. So this was the question. Avalokiteshvara is known as Padmapani. And this painting I'm talking about, where he is shown holding lotus flower, is in Ajanta caves. Then the second is Vajrapani. He is also one of the 3 protective deities who have been depicted in Ajanta caves. So these both have been depicted in Ajanta caves, AV and VA. Both have been depicted. And what Vajrapani does is he manifests all powers of Buddha plus 5 Tathagats. So he's like Thanos. Thanos holds the power of 5 infinity stones. So Vajrapani holds the power of Buddha plus as well as 5 Tathagats. The third one is Manjushri. Manjushri is associated with wisdom of Buddha. He is a male Bodhisattva and he is wielding sword. Avalokiteshvara is holding lotus flower and Manjushri is holding sword. Fourth is Kshitigarbha. Kshitigarbha is actually a Buddhist monk who has also been considered a Bodhisattva. He has taken vow not to achieve Buddhahood till hell is completely emptied. So he has vowed that he will never achieve Buddhahood till hell is completely emptied. Now, in 1998, many Greeks, Kushans and Shakas, I call them GKS, so these had embraced Buddhism. What was the reason behind embracing Buddhism rather than Hinduism? Option first is Buddhism was in the ascendant at that time. So Buddhism was gaining prominence. Second is they had renounced the policy of war and violence. Third is caste-ridden Hinduism did not. And the fourth option is Buddhism provided easier access to Indian society. So the answer is the third option. The caste-ridden Hinduism did not attract them. They did not wanted to follow this complex structure of caste-ridden Hinduism. In 1998, it was asked that Buddha Charit was written by which author? It was written by Ashwaghosh. Actually, this was not the direct question where it was asked that who wrote Buddha Charit, but it was asked to correctly match, and this was given. This matching was given as the wrong one. In 1998, again it was asked correctly matched or not. So Lothal was matched as ancient Dokyor, Sarnath was matched as first sermon of Buddha. Rajgir, lion capital of Ashoka. Nalanda was matched as great seat of Buddhist learning. So, which one is matched correctly? This one is matched correctly. This one is obviously matched correctly. And this one is also matched correctly. But this one is not matched correctly because Rajgir in Bihar does not have the lion capital of Ashok, but Sarnath in UP. So here it is Sarnath again. Now the concept of eightfold path forms the theme of which of the following? The first is Deepvamsa, second is Divya Vadan, third is Mahaparinibban, and the fourth is Dharmachakra Pravartan Sut. So the eightfold path theme forms the theme of this Dharmachakra Pravartan Sut, and eightfold path is also depicted sometimes as a wheel. So that is it guys for this part 1. I hope you liked this video, and I would be posting the part 2 soon. I hope this can help some people, even few only, but yeah, if it is helpful for them, I would be very happy. So see you in next video. Bye.